The crystalline spires of the Centauri Institute pierced the purple sky of Proxima II like needles of pure light. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the base of the main tower, her breath creating small clouds in the chilly alien air. After 3 months of faster-than-light travel and countless security clearances, she had finally arrived at the most prestigious research facility in known space. The gravity felt slightly wrong, a constant reminder that she was very far from Earth. At just over 1.2 standard Earth gravities, it made her movements feel sluggish and her bones ache. But Sarah had grown up in the mining colonies of Mars, and adaptation was in her blood. "Dr. Chen, welcome to the Institute." The voice belonged to first scholar Valeri, a Proximan whose iridescent scales shifted through shades of blue and green as they spoke. Though I must admit, we were surprised when the Earth Alliance insisted on sending a human xenoarchaeologist to study the Nexus cipher. Sarah smiled diplomatically, having expected this reaction. Humans were still newcomers to the Galactic community, barely 2 centuries into their membership. To species like the Proximans, who measured their civilizations in millennia, humanity was barely out of its infancy. "First scholar, I'm honored to be here," she replied, following the tall alien through the Institute's entrance. "I studied the preliminary data on the cipher, 3,000 years of research, and still no breakthrough. Perhaps a fresh perspective is exactly what's needed." Valeri's scales flickered briefly to orange, amusement Sarah recalled from her xenobiology briefings. "Fresh perspective. Dr. Chen, the Nexus cipher has been studied by the finest minds of 12 different species. The combined consciousness of the Hive Collective spent a century analyzing its patterns. The quantum computers of the Silicon Dominion ran simulations for 500 years. They entered a vast circular chamber dominated by a floating obsidian cube, the Nexus cipher itself." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Holoprojectors surrounded the artifact, displaying incomprehensible strings of symbols and mathematical formulae. Dozens of alien scholars worked at various stations, their appendages dancing through holographic interfaces. And yet, Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on the cube, "It remains locked." The cube was surprisingly small for an artifact of its importance, barely 2 meters on each side. Its surface seemed to drink in light, creating the illusion of infinite depth. Geometric patterns shifted across its faces like oil on water, never repeating, never settling into recognizable forms. "The cipher appeared in our space 3,000 years ago," Valeri explained, leading Sarah to an empty workstation. "We believe it contains the key to true faster-than-light travel, not the crude approximation your species uses, but genuine manipulation of space-time itself. Every attempt to decode its messages has failed. The patterns resist all known forms of analysis." Sarah began unpacking her equipment, mostly standard Institute gear, but with a few specialized tools of her own design. "Tell me, first scholar, has anyone ever tried not analyzing it?" Valeri's scales shifted to a confused purple. "I don't understand." "Sometimes," Sarah said, calibrating her instruments, "we humans find that the harder we try to solve a puzzle, the more it eludes us. Sometimes the solution comes when we step back and simply observe." "A characteristically human approach," Valeri said, their tone diplomatic but skeptical. "Your species does have a remarkable talent for unconventional thinking. Though I must remind you that the Institute's protocols for artifact study are quite strict." Sarah nodded, already losing herself in the hypnotic patterns on the cube's surface. Something about them seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. "Of course, first scholar. I'll review all protocols thoroughly." As Valeri glided away to attend to other matters, Sarah settled into her workstation. The chamber hummed with the quiet intensity of deep research, the subtle clicks of alien appendages on control surfaces, the soft whir of quantum processors, the occasional murmured discussion in a dozen different languages. She pulled up the Institute's complete historical database on the cipher, 3,000 years of failed attempts and frustrated brilliance. but her eyes kept being drawn back to the cube itself, to the way its patterns flowed and shifted. Something about the movement tugged at her memory, reminded her of something she'd seen long ago, back on Earth. The work ahead would be challenging, but Sarah felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. After all, humanity had spent its entire history solving puzzles that nature had never intended them to solve. What was one more impossible challenge? As the alien sun set outside, casting the chamber in deep purple shadows, Dr. Sarah Chen began her first day of work on a mystery that had baffled the galaxy's greatest minds for 3 millennia. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to change everything they thought they knew about the universe, and about humanity's place in it. Sarah's first week at the Centauri Institute passed in a blur of data streams and frustrated hypotheses. While other researchers manipulated complex quantum algorithms and ran probability matrices, she spent hours simply watching the patterns flow across the Nexus cipher surface. Her behavior drew increasingly skeptical looks from her alien colleagues. Researcher Chen called out Dr. Extol, a crystalline being from the Silicon Dominion, their faceted body refracting light, as they approached her workstation. "Our sensors indicate you haven't initiated any deep scanning sequences today. Are your instruments malfunctioning?" Sarah looked up from her handwritten notes. Actual paper and pen, another oddity that had caused much confusion among the Institute's staff. "No malfunction, Dr. Extol. I'm trying something different." Different. The crystalline being's surfaces clouded slightly, their equivalent of a frown. "The Institute has established proper procedures for artifact analysis, procedures refined over thousands of years. And in those thousands of years," Sarah replied gently, "has anyone tried looking for simpler patterns? Something basic, fundamental." Basic? Extol's crystalline form vibrated with what might have been offense. "The Nexus cipher is the most sophisticated artifact ever discovered. Its complexity exceeds everything we've ever seen." "Yes," Sarah finished. "But what if that's exactly what's throwing us off? What if we're seeing complexity because we're looking for it?" She pulled up her notes on the main holographic display. Instead of the usual quantum formula and multidimensional calculations, her screen showed simple geometric sketches and what appeared to be children's counting games from Earth. A small crowd had gathered now, various alien scholars drawn by the unusual discussion. Sarah could feel their confusion, their barely concealed disdain for her primitive methods. But something had been nagging at her since her first day, and she couldn't shake it. "Look at this pattern here." She pointed to a particular sequence on the cube's surface. "Everyone assumes it's some kind of advanced mathematical code, right? But watch how it moves." The assembled scholars watched as the pattern shifted and flowed, their various sensory organs focused intently on the display. "It reminds me of something from Earth's history," Sarah continued. "Ancient humans used to create puzzle boxes, physical containers that required specific sequences of movements to open. They weren't just locks. They were teaching tools, ways to pass down knowledge through direct experience rather than written instructions." First scholar Valeri had joined the group, their scales now a deep shade of intellectual curiosity. "Are you suggesting the Nexus cipher is merely a toy?" "Not a toy." Sarah shook her head. "A test. Look at how the patterns respond to different types of energy emissions. Everyone's been trying to decode them as if they're pure information, but what if they're more like muscle memory?" She pulled up historical data from the Institute's archives. Every species that studied the cipher has approached it from their own technological perspective. The Silicon Dominion looked for computational patterns. The Hive Collective searched for networked consciousness signatures. The Proximan scholars analyzed quantum state variations. "And how else should we approach it?" demanded another researcher, a floating gas cloud contained within a complex electromagnetic field. "Should we perhaps knock on it and ask it to open?" Sarah smiled, remembering similar skepticism from her academic days on Earth. "Actually, that's not far from what I want to try. But first, I need to show you something else I've noticed." She overlaid the cipher's pattern movements with a simple animation she created. This sequence here, it's not random. It's not even particularly complex. It's a representation of binary star orbital mechanics, but not the way we understand them now. It's showing the way ancient pre-spaceflight cultures might have perceived such movement from the ground. A murmur ran through the assembled scholars. Valerie's scales shifted to a deep purple of intense concentration. That's an interesting hypothesis, Dr. Chen. But surely such a primitive representation wouldn't be used in an artifact of this sophistication. Unless, Sarah said, her excitement building. That's exactly the point. What if the cipher isn't just testing our scientific knowledge? What if it's testing our ability to understand different perspectives? To think like those who came before us? She stood up, approaching the cube with purpose. Every spacefaring species develops along different lines, discovers different principles first. But there are some experiences that are universal, looking up at the stars, trying to make sense of patterns, learning to think in new ways. The chamber had grown quiet, all attention focused on the human researcher and her unorthodox ideas. Even the most skeptical scholars couldn't deny that she'd found something in the patterns that thousands of years of traditional analysis had missed. "I'd like to try an experiment," Sarah announced, "but I'll need to modify some of the scanning equipment." And, she added with a slight smile, "I might need to break a few standard protocols." Valerie's scales flickered through several colors before settling on a shade Sarah had never seen before. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Chen?" Sarah's eyes gleamed with the kind of determination that had carried humanity from their first steps on the moon to the stars themselves. "I think it's time we stopped trying to talk to the cipher in our language and started listening to what it's been trying to tell us in its own." The modifications to the Institute's scanning equipment took 3 days to complete, during which Sarah faced constant resistance from the facility's more traditional researchers. She worked through the alien nights, her body still running on Earth time, making adjustments that many of her colleagues considered barbaric in their simplicity. "You're attaching mechanical resonators to a quantum-sensitive artifact." Dr. Xtel's crystalline form had taken on a stressed, jagged appearance. "This is unprecedented and possibly dangerous." Sarah carefully calibrated another of the small devices she'd fabricated in the Institute's workshop. "Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones. Besides, look at these markings here." She pointed to a series of concentric circles on one face of the cube. "They're not just decorative. They're focal points." The chamber had been cleared of all but essential personnel, her experiment deemed too risky to allow full access. First scholar Valerie observed from a safe distance, their scales shifting between anxiety and curiosity. "Dr. Chen," Valerie called out, "the Institute's council has expressed concerns about your approach. They feel that exposing the cipher to primitive vibration patterns could potentially damage it." Sarah straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead. The higher gravity was still taking its toll, but she'd learned to work through the discomfort. "With respect, First Scholar, I believe the cipher was designed to be exposed to exactly this kind of interaction." She gestured to her modified equipment. "Every species that studied this artifact has tried to decode it using their most advanced technology. But look at how it's constructed. The patterns, the resonance chambers inside. This wasn't built for quantum computers or consciousness networks. It was built to respond to something more fundamental." "Explain," Valerie demanded, their scales now showing genuine interest despite their reservations. Sarah activated a holographic display, showing the internal structure of the cipher that thousands of scans had revealed. "These chambers, these pathways, they're like the inner ear of almost every species that evolved to perceive sound. They're tuned to specific frequencies, specific patterns of vibration." "But we've analyzed all possible frequency combinations," protested another researcher, a hovering collection of tentacles and sensors. "The mathematical possibilities." "That's just it," Sarah interrupted. "We've been thinking mathematically, digitally. But what if the key isn't in the frequencies themselves, but in how they interact, how they feel?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made several scholars recoil in surprise. A small wooden cube, clearly handmade, its surface carved with intricate patterns. "This is a puzzle box my grandfather made," she explained. "He was a master carpenter. No electronics, no quantum states, just wood and precision and patience. The solution isn't in understanding how it works, it's in learning to feel the right sequence of movements." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah activated her modified scanners. The resonators hummed to life, sending carefully calibrated vibrations through the cipher structure. The patterns on its surface began to shift more rapidly than ever before. "The patterns we've been seeing," she explained as she worked. "They're not just data. They're instructions, teaching tools. The same sequence, repeated over and over, showing us how to think about the puzzle in front of us." She adjusted the frequencies, watching the patterns dance across the cube's surface. Every spacefaring species had to solve certain fundamental problems to reach the stars. Physics, mathematics, engineering. But before any of that, they had to learn to recognize patterns, to think abstractly, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. The chamber filled with a deep, harmonic resonance as Sarah's devices found matching frequencies within the cipher. The patterns on its surface began to align in ways never seen before, forming new configurations that seemed to pulse with inner light. "It's not testing our technology," Sarah said softly, her hands moving across her control panel with practiced precision. "It's testing our ability to learn, to adapt, to think like beginners again." Suddenly, the cube emitted a soft chime, a perfect, pure note that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the mind. The patterns froze, then began to rotate in perfect synchronization. "That's impossible," whispered Dr. Extel. "The patterns have never synchronized before." Sarah smiled, but kept her focus on the readings. "Because we've been trying to force them into alignment, but they don't need to be forced. They just need to be." "Understood." The chime came again, louder this time. The cube's surface began to ripple like liquid metal, the patterns flowing together in ways that defied the laws of physics as most species understood them. "Dr. Chen," Valerie's voice was urgent now, their scales blazing with excitement and fear. "What exactly is happening?" "It's responding," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "For the first time in 3,000 years, it's actually responding. And I think it's ready to show us something new." The cube's resonance reached a crescendo, and suddenly the patterns crystallized into a single coherent image, a map unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. But before they could begin to understand what they were seeing, alarms began blaring throughout the Institute. "Security breach in Sector 7, announced an automated voice. "Unknown entities have penetrated the outer defenses. All personnel, initiate emergency protocols." Sarah looked up from her work, her heart racing. After 3,000 years, the cipher had finally begun to open. And now someone was trying to steal it. The real test was about to begin. Red emergency lights pulsed through the chamber as security barriers began sliding into place. The cipher's patterns were still shifting, revealing more of its secrets with each passing moment, but Sarah could hear the sounds of conflict echoing through the Institute's corridors. "Security systems compromised," the automated voice announced. "Unauthorized access detected in multiple sectors. We need to shut down the experiment," Dr. Extel insisted, their crystalline form flickering with distress patterns. "The cipher must be secured. We can't stop now." Sarah protested, her eyes fixed on the evolving patterns. "Look at what it's showing us. These aren't just star maps, they're navigation protocols. If we interrupt the sequence..." An explosion rocked the chamber, and the massive doors buckled inward. Through the smoke strode figures in sleek environmental suits, their designs unlike anything used by known species. Energy weapons hummed to life in their hands. "Step away from the artifact," commanded a modulated voice. "The cipher belongs to those who can truly understand it." Sarah's mind raced. The security barriers hadn't even slowed them down. They'd clearly studied the Institute's defenses, but there was one thing they couldn't have planned for: human unpredictability. "Valerie," she whispered to the first scholar, "your species can detect vibration patterns through your scales, right?" The Proximan scholar's scales rippled with confusion. "Yes, but when I give the signal, cover your sensory organs." Sarah's hands moved carefully across her control panel, making subtle adjustments to the resonator frequencies. To the intruders, it would look like she was powering down the equipment. "A wise choice," the lead intruder said, approaching the cube. "The Nexus cipher has waited long enough for proper implementation. Your primitive attempts at—" Sarah slammed her hand down on the control panel. The resonators screamed to life at maximum power, but at frequencies she carefully calculated. The chamber filled with harmonics that made the very air vibrate. The intruders staggered, their suits' systems disrupted by the unexpected sonic assault. Valerie and the other scholars had heeded her warning, but the attackers weren't prepared for the devastating combination of frequencies Sarah had unleashed. "The human auditory range," Dr. Still exclaimed, "their crystalline form safely insulated from the sonic attack. You weaponized our own scanning equipment." "Growing up on Mars taught me to use whatever's available," Sarah grunted, fighting against the higher gravity as she moved to protect the cipher. "Sound travels differently in pressurized habitats. You learn to be careful with resonance." But the intruders were already recovering, their suits adapting to the sonic attack. The leader raised their weapon, aiming not at the researchers but at the cipher itself. "If we cannot have it," the modulated voice declared, "no one will." Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove forward, her muscles screaming in the heavy gravity, and slammed into the control panel of her modified scanning equipment. The resonators shrieked one final time before overloading in a cascade of sparks. The chamber plunged into darkness. When the emergency lights flickered back on seconds later, the scene had changed dramatically. The cipher's patterns had frozen in place, preserving the partial revelation of its secrets. The intruders lay unconscious, their suits disabled by the power surge, and Sarah stood before the cube, her makeshift sonic weapon smoldering behind her. "Dr. Chen." Valerie rushed forward, their scales a riot of colors. "Are you injured?" "The gravity." "I'm fine," Sarah managed, though every muscle ached from the exertion. "The cipher?" "Stable," Dr. Still reported, running scans with their built-in sensors. "But the patterns, they're locked in place. We cannot complete the sequence." Sarah straightened up, grimacing. "No, but look at what we did manage to capture. Those navigation protocols. The star maps, they're unlike anything we've seen before. The cipher wasn't just showing us faster than light travel. It was showing us how to think about space itself in a completely different way." Institute security forces finally burst into the chamber, securing the unconscious intruders. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah found herself drawn back to the frozen patterns on the cube's surface. "Who were they?" she asked, nodding toward the attackers. "Unknown," Valerie replied, their scales settling into a troubled purple. "But the fact that they knew exactly when to strike, just as we achieved first breakthrough in 3,000 years, suggests we're not the only ones who've been watching the cipher," Sarah finished. She studied the complex patterns, now static but still revealing. "And I have a feeling we're not going to like what we find when we dig deeper." Dr. Still's crystalline form caught the emergency lights, casting complex shadows. "The Council will want to suspend all research after this incident. Security protocols." "With respect," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "We don't have time for protocols anymore. Something is coming. The cipher wasn't just teaching us about space travel, it was trying to warn us. And now that we've started to understand its message." She touched the cube's surface gently, feeling the subtle vibrations still running through its structure. "We need to finish what we started, not just for the Institute, but for every spacefaring species." The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. They had unlocked part of the cipher's mystery, but in doing so, they might have triggered something far larger than anyone had anticipated. And somewhere out in the darkness between the stars, others were watching, waiting to see what they would do next. The days following the attack transformed the Centauri Institute. Security protocols were heightened, research teams reorganized, and most significantly, Dr. Sarah Chen's primitive methods were no longer met with skepticism. The partial activation of the Nexus cipher had proven that 3,000 years of conventional wisdom needed serious revision. Sarah stood before the assembled Galactic Science Council, her body still adjusting to the medical treatments for her gravity-induced injuries. The chamber was filled with representatives from every major spacefaring species, their attention fixed on the holographic displays showing the cipher's revealed patterns. "What you're looking at," Sarah explained, "isn't just a map or a set of equations. It's a Rosetta Stone for understanding space itself." She gestured to the complex geometries floating in the air. Each pattern is both a lesson and a warning. First, Scholar Valeri, now bearing the marks of special commendation on their scales, stepped forward. "Dr. Chen's insights have led us to a stunning conclusion. The cipher wasn't created by a long-lost advanced civilization, as we'd always assumed. It was created by a coalition of developing species, working together to preserve crucial knowledge." A murmur ran through the assembled council. Sarah continued, "The attack wasn't random. Analysis of the intruders' equipment suggests they represent a group that's been monitoring developing civilizations, preventing them from achieving certain technological breakthroughs." She brought up new images, reconstructions based on the cipher's patterns. "The universe is more complex than we imagined. True faster than light travel, the kind the cipher describes, doesn't just bend space. It connects civilizations, and some groups apparently want to control those connections. But why?" demanded a representative of the Silicon Dominion. "Why create such an elaborate test?" Sarah smiled. "Because the test itself is the point. The cipher doesn't just verify technological advancement. It confirms cultural readiness, the ability to step back, to think differently, to combine perspectives. No single species working alone could have unlocked it." She touched a control, and the patterns shifted, revealing new depths. "The resonance chambers we discovered. They're tuned to frequencies that most spacefaring species can detect, but each in different ways. The geometric puzzles. They're based on mathematical principles that every technological civilization must master, but approached from multiple angles." "And the warning," Valeri prompted, their scales showing deep concern. "The patterns we uncovered suggest that space itself is more alive than we thought. Traditional faster-than-light travel has been like walking through a forest blindfolded, hoping not to bump into trees. The cipher shows us that there are paths, currents, and predators." The chamber erupted in discussion, dozens of species trying to process the implications. Sarah waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "But here's the most important part. The cipher wasn't just teaching us about space. It was teaching us about cooperation. Every major breakthrough in unlocking it came when we combined different perspectives. My primitive human approach only worked because it built on 3,000 years of prior research by other species." She gestured to the frozen patterns still visible on the cipher's surface. "We've only decoded part of its message, but I believe the next steps will require even more collaboration. The attack proved that there are forces out there trying to keep civilizations divided, controlled. The cipher is a tool to fight that, not with weapons, but with understanding." Dr. Xtul's crystalline form caught the light as they spoke. "The Council has reviewed Dr. Chen's findings. We propose the formation of a new division within the Institute, one dedicated to combining methods from all our species, including unconventional approaches." "Unconventional," Sarah chuckled, like a human suggesting we just need to listen to what an ancient artifact is trying to tell us. The chamber filled with various forms of alien laughter, from crystalline chimes to subsonic rumbles. The tension that had filled the council chamber began to ease. "There is an old human saying," Sarah continued, her voice growing serious. Standing on the shoulders of giants, we thought we were looking for pure knowledge in the cipher, but what we found was something more valuable. A reminder that true progress comes from combining perspectives, from being willing to think like beginners again, from working together. She touched the cipher's surface one last time, feeling the subtle vibrations that still ran through it. The message isn't finished. There's more to decode, more to understand. But now we know we're not just looking for technological secrets, we're looking for ways to think differently, to grow, to combine the wisdom of ages with the fresh perspectives of newcomers. "And what of these predators in space?" asked a council member. "These forces that would keep us divided." Sarah's expression hardened with the determination that had driven humanity from their first cave paintings to the stars themselves. "We face them the same way we cracked the cipher, together. Every species brings something unique to the table, even us primitive humans." As the council chamber filled with renewed discussion and planning, Sarah looked out at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. The cipher had been more than a puzzle or a repository of knowledge. It had been a test, not of technology or intelligence, but of wisdom. The wisdom to know that sometimes the simplest solutions require the most complex understanding, and that true progress came not from surpassing other species, but from learning to work with them. The next phase of galactic civilization was beginning, and thanks to a human's willingness to think differently, to combine the old with the new, the simple with the complex, they would face it together. And somewhere, Sarah suspected, the creators of the cipher were watching, waiting to see what their students would do next.